Welcome to Insider Events, Transforming Business, presented by Alight. Here's our host, Editor of Special Projects, Ashley Davis.
Hi, I'm Ashley Davis, Editor of Special Projects here at Insider. It's an honor to be your host for today's event, Transforming Business, presented by Alight. The Transforming Business series is one of Insider's most prominent list features, where we profile 100 leaders, activists, researchers, and trailblazers across 10 different sectors. The following talks highlight a few of these transformers who are leading the conversations in DEI, the future of work, and healthcare. The full list of transformers is featured on a stunning homepage. There you'll find the 100 profiles and in-depth articles covering the trends dominating each sector. Feel free to check out the link below to view the full series. Our intention for this event is to showcase outstanding people and their stories of business transformation. Here, we're going to learn what's driving them to spark positive change and the strategies they're using to realize these goals. We'd love for you to be part of that conversation. Please share your thoughts about today's panels on social media by using the hashtag InsiderEvents. You can also ask our panelists questions by using the dashboard at the bottom of your screen. We'd love to hear your feedback. And now, I'm delighted to introduce our first session. Marguerite Ward, Insider's correspondent who covers diversity, inclusion, and leadership topics, is leading a conversation on how to make the workplace more equitable. Over to you, Marguerite.
Thank you, Ashley. Hi, I'm Marguerite Ward, Leadership Correspondent at Insider. The blares of police sirens and chants of Black Lives Matter have subsided since the summer of 2020, when George Floyd's murder shook the nation, but calls for equity remain. A recent survey of 3,000 Americans from Just Capital, a nonprofit research firm, shows that most people want CEOs to speak out on social justice issues. They want leaders to stand up for marginalized communities. Now, diversity and inclusion looks different to every person because there are so many things that make people unique. But are CEOs grasping the depth of what equity truly means, and are they responding to these calls? What does the future of inclusion look like? Joining me to discuss this are three key leaders from Disability In, a leading nonprofit that's working with top business leaders to champion disability rights. Since disability impacts people of all races, genders, and backgrounds, they're in a unique position to comment on the state of inclusion. I'm happy to present my guests today, Jill Houghton, CEO of Disability In, Bridget Anderson, Disability's Senior Manager, helping companies create inclusive talent strategies, and Dorothy Garcia, the Senior Manager of the Global Disability Equality Index, an analysis companies can use to see how well they're doing on disability rights. Jill, thanks so much for joining me. Thank you to all our guests. Let's start with you. As the CEO of Disability In, you partner with CEOs from top companies to make their policies more inclusive. And since founding in 1999, your organization has helped hundreds of thousands of people with disabilities start their careers. How has the conversation around inclusion changed, particularly since the summer of 2020?
Thank you so much, Marguerite, for the opportunity to be here today and to engage in this important dialogue. And I would tell you that you called it out with things like Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement and the global pandemic. We've seen record numbers of people leaving the workforce. And I think that what we've seen is this incredible opportunity for business to prioritize diversity and inclusion. And from Disability In's perspective, that includes disability. And they have an opportunity and a responsibility to reimagine the culture of their businesses in a way that is accessible, inclusive, and equitable for all people.
So you really agree that we're in a special moment in history?
Absolutely. I think that two of the things that we've really leaned into heavily, and we have a lot more work to do around them, one is mental health. I mean, look, the Surgeon General just came out this week and called out that we have a mental health epidemic with our youth. We have a real opportunity and responsibility in business to acknowledge that we are all touched by mental health, and that business has an opportunity to be more inclusive and to really raise this conversation and create that culture where people can bring their whole authentic self to the workplace. I think the second issue is that we're 31 years past the Americans with Disabilities Act, and 31 years ago, it was about getting access to buses and telecommunications and public facilities and employment. And if we fast forward to today, we need to continue to work on all of those things. But the new front door is digital, right? It's our apps, it's our AI, it's the cloud, it's our payroll, it's our internal websites, it's our external websites. And business has an opportunity and a responsibility to advance in an accessible, inclusive manner for all.
You bring up a really important point that we're all impacted by disability when it comes to mental health. And that's something that's really changed the conversation in the past few months. Jill, do leaders understand how uplifting people with disabilities helps all employees, or are they still struggling with that?
I think that the reality is we're barely scratching the surface. There is stigma, and there is bias that exists around disability, and I think that people don't want to talk about it because they don't know, and they're scared that they're going to say or do the wrong thing. And so perhaps we've viewed disability in a manner of being more a medical condition. And at Disability In, we believe and we know that disability is a natural part of the human experience, that disability is a strength, and that when business includes us, I myself am a person with a non-apparent disability, and over 70% of us have disabilities you can't see, right? So it's things like learning disabilities, depression, anxiety, autism, diabetes. We bring this beautiful strength to business. And so at Disability In, we're really focused on tearing down the stigma and that medical model and focusing on the fact that disability is a strength, and that businesses that are inclusive of people with disabilities are actually more competitive.
I love that. We'll definitely revisit that topic. I also want to take this opportunity to say that I am a person with non-visible disabilities. I think awareness is key. Bridget, I want to turn to you. You're helping companies create inclusive strategies for hiring, retaining, and promoting people with disabilities. So you're doing a lot of the boots on the ground work. What's one thing diversity leaders are doing well when it comes to creating inclusive cultures, and what's something that they're struggling with?
I honestly think, from my perspective with the talent teams coming down from conversations with leadership, they are excelling in thoughtfulness, being creative, wanting to learn, wanting to be inclusive. And so thinking through new strategies, implementing new processes, definitely addressing within our trainings, whether they're through Disability In, the biases that they've had and just didn't know. Implementation of all things, including interviews, job description writing, formatting. Doesn't always have to be in person. If you're going to do it virtually, how can we be inclusive? So the first step, honestly, of just what they're doing extraordinarily well is the knowledge. They are seeking the information and then implementing it and implementing those new processes very, very well. One thing I think that a broad amount of industries still struggle with is just they don't know what they don't know. And as Jill mentioned, the fear of addressing something that they're just not familiar with, being afraid of maybe saying the wrong thing, implementing the wrong thing, or highlighting something that's different can be intimidating. So there's still, a bucket of growth that needs to go on. But without a doubt, leadership, CEOs, talent teams are really being considerate around all things diversity, whatever that looks like specifically within the disability space, and how they can be more inclusive.
And Bridget, you bring up an important point that in order to make this change, you have to have courageous conversations. Are these executives willing to have that? And maybe could you give me an example of something an executive recently said to you that led to change?
Absolutely. So one of the best conversations I actually had with a leadership team was just understanding that for a very long time in their particular company within this industry, they checked a box. Diversity was race and gender. In the last couple of decades, recognized that also included sexual orientation. And it had a lot to do with being a part of a group that was known as a best places to work. Whereas now the conversation has completely changed. The thought process around it, the open-mindedness about diversity in general has absolutely pivoted, where CEOs leadership recognize the benefit of diversity being benefit of thought, the diversity of experience, the diversity of knowledge, and how bringing in all people of all walks of life with all types of abilities can only make their organization better, can only make it a more robust and successful industry as they grow and spread that knowledge.
That's really encouraging. Dorothy, you're Senior Manager of the Global Disability Equality Index, a tool top companies are using to measure how well they're doing in terms of disability rights. Are you seeing more interest from CEOs and execs in the past year or two? And how are you feeling about the future of inclusion in corporate America?
So I have been fortunate enough to be in the disability space since 2016. And I feel like in that whole time, I and my colleagues were making the business case. All the reasons that companies should pay more attention to people with disabilities as a market share and people with disabilities as a pool of talent that largely goes unnoticed. 2021 was a banner year. This was the pilot year for our Global Disability Equality Index. We expected interest since it was our partners that drove us to have a global equivalent to our current US DEI, but I didn't expect the level of interest that we've gotten. I mean, I think Jill and Bridget can speak to the fact that we've never been busier before. And there's definitely a shift in how we talk about disability inclusion. So in the past, as I said before, we had to make the business case. And this time they already know it. I don't know if you've heard in the news about the Great Resignation, the fact that there's a labor crunch that's kind of being felt around the world, and how that has repercussions because we're all working from Zoom and we all are connected to each other globally. And so that Great Resignation is really driving a lot of employers to take a look at this new talent pool of disabled employees and think, what can we do to attract more of them? What can we do to make ourselves a more inclusive company?
Dorothy and Bridget, you're both women of color and bring a unique perspective. Bridget, I want to start with you and then turn to Dorothy. Talk to me about intersectionality, of championing Black voices and voices of color while also championing disability rights. Do you think Black Lives Matter has created the space for more discussion around disability rights?
I think that's a good question. I wouldn't say that Black Lives Matter created the space, but maybe did add to opening that conversation. I do think that disability inclusion in the workplace was always a conversation that had been had prior to the Black Lives Matter movement. But I do think that With the Black Lives Matter movement, CEOs have been very thoughtful around the plight of the Black experience, what their employees are dealing with, mentally how and emotionally how they're feeling, and giving them a safe space to discuss those feelings, to talk about them, being a part of those conversations. And so, in a way, addressing that Black Lives Matter movement is absolutely, without a doubt, helping stir the conversation around disability inclusion for sure.
Bridget, do business leaders still see inclusion as either you're championing one or the other, or are they seeing how race and disability intersect?
I think that they're beginning to see how they intersect. Personally, for me, there's an absolute intersection, and I think that as time continues to go on, people, especially leadership, are learning. I, as a Black educated woman married to a Black educated man, very handsome husband, understand completely the mental the mental faults that we have as a community, as a Black community, the traumas that we are dealing with on a regular basis. Every time my husband walks out of my door, I'm concerned about his well-being, and I don't have peace until he is back in my home. That said, I am one of a huge population, that, in a broad sense, we are a very small population, but hold a huge population of disability. So not a parent and a parent, we have all of those disabilities. And I think starting the conversation around race, disparities, whether it's poverty, healthcare, like said, generational traumas and whatnot, recognizing what those are, specific to race, opens the door to having conversation about disability inclusion in particular. And so I think that as the conversations continue, as CEOs and leadership continue to learn, and really open their minds to what their workforce is dealing with, recognizing that this is a movement, not based on hurt feelings, but true experience. It absolutely is the intersection that they're recognizing. One and the other do go along, and they need to face both of them to make the best of their growth and their talent planning. Really, they're absolutely recognizing it. It's a slow move, but without a doubt, the conversations have been started. They're absolutely seeing it, and there is growth.
That makes me really hopeful. Dorothy, talk to me about the same thing. What are your thoughts on the future of intersectionality?
So I think that what leadership and these companies are coming to realize is that by having practices that are inclusive of people with disabilities, they're also attracting job seekers who want the same things. So a lot of the adjustments that have been made over the past year or so are flexible work, the ability to work from home, the ability to work from home a few days a week, even if you have to go in a few times a week, more benefits that center around mental health and wellness. And, I'm a person who understands that disability intersects with a lot of other different identities. So if you actually appeal to a group that needs accessibility and kinds of supports and disability-friendly policies, you are also including a lot of different groups that have a hard time making their voices heard. So I'm Filipino, I have a disability, I'm a working mom, and all of these policies that have to do with flexible work, the additional benefits around mental health, those appeal to me and all of my other identities as well. And so it's not really a niche kind of outreach. It is the kind of outreach that appeals to the most amount of people.
I love that. You're absolutely right. We've been talking in broad terms, but I want to get to the specifics. Jill, what's one company that's tackling inclusion really well? And can you share some work that you've done with them at Disability In and what other companies can learn from that experience?
So, I hate to single out one company because I think that there are so many companies that are on this journey, and no one company has it all figured out. But what we do know is that there are many like best practices. So we've talked a little bit today about the Disability Equality Index. And for those of you that are not familiar with it, it's a tool that was designed in partnership between Disability In and the American Association of People with Disabilities. And it measures leadership and culture, enterprise-wide access, employment practices, community engagement, supplier diversity, and non-US operations. It has weighted questions and non-weighted questions, and it is designed to help a business measure, prioritize disability inclusion, measure and develop metrics where they're holding individuals accountable. So what are some best practices that come out of the DEI? We know that leadership and culture, right? Like that eats strategy for lunch every day of the week. So it really starts at the top. And it starts with CEOs and senior leaders identifying that disability is part of the diversity and inclusion agenda, and then holding people accountable for metrics. If we look at the participating companies in the DEI, and this year we had 319, so we saw a 29% increase. We saw 67 in the Fortune 100 participate, which is a huge improvement. But what we know is that there's so much more work to do. And so we're just getting started. And we need more companies. In fact, registration's open right now. We need more companies to utilize the DEI, to get involved, and to prioritize disability inclusion, and then to use their voice. We actually have a CEO letter for corporate disability inclusion, and over the course of the last year, the number of CEOs has nearly doubled. We're approaching 100 of CEOs of these very large Fortune 500 companies that are using their voice and saying disability inclusion is important, it's a priority, and we're going to use a tool like the DEI.
I love that. And you bring up a really important point that progress relies on metrics. But what's interesting is a company can analyze their metrics and do that by themselves. Why work with a consultancy and a nonprofit like Disability In? Jill, I want to start with you and then open it up to all of our guests. But why work with you? What do you offer?
Disability In is a global catalyst. We were based on the premise. We are a movement that was born by people with lived experience. We are the place where business and disability intersect, and business responds to their peers. You are competitive. So Disability In is the place where you come together and you learn from each other, not why, but how. How to include people with disabilities across your business as employees, as customers, as shareholders. And we don't just operate within these borders. We operate around the globe, and everything that we do is in response to what business is asking for.
Wonderful. Before we turn to our Q&A, Bridget, do you have anything to add to that? And then Dorothy?
Just going to piggyback on what Jill said. I think, partnering with Disability In is a benefit to any company that is wanting to be inclusive. Inclusion Works is a program within Disability In that offers the one-on-one consulting from everything that you can think of, from accessibility, accommodations, and training within those spaces, but then also, of course, talent planning, hiring, just being creative and thoughtful about the things that they don't know, how they can do it, and like Jill said, learning from each other how to do it well. From learned experience, from consultants that know the space extremely well and will get companies and leadership on the right track to being a more inclusive platform for internal employees, but then also incoming.
Dorothy, how about you?
I would add that the advantage lies in not only just getting metrics. So you were saying that if you did it internally, there's always that option to be able to do that audit internally. But within the Disability Equality Index, you have the opportunity to benchmark your inclusion efforts against other companies in your industry. So within a scorecard, you receive an answer to a question that says, okay, this is a policy that you've implemented. 75% of people in your industry do this as well. And it's just nice to have that indicator, especially if you want to stay on top of the market and if you want to remain competitive.
Awesome. Let's open it up to our audience Q&A. Be sure to submit questions. The first one that's coming through is, what's one thing managers can do to create more inclusive cultures today? Jill, let's start with you. What's one great takeaway that our viewers can have?
Lead with humanity. I think that the pandemic has created an opportunity for managers to check in with their people and say, it's okay to not be okay, and to better understand what your team's needs are, and then work to be responsive.
Bridget, how about you? What's a takeaway that you would like to see more managers or executives do to create inclusive cultures?
I always start my trainings with kindness. Be kind, be thoughtful, take a minute to really consider yourself, the position that you're in, and the position that others are in. Candidates with disabilities are very capable and very qualified for these opportunities. So be thoughtful around what they can bring, also around the variety of change that you can implement. Like I had mentioned earlier, whether it's an interview strategy or reviewing resumes, there's always a way to be very considerate and thoughtful about those things. So just take a moment, think about it, and be open-minded to the possibilities.
I love that. Kindness is so important. Dorothy, how about you? One takeaway for managers?
I think that there is a sense that disability is a different group. And what's coming out of the pandemic is that what we as people with disabilities want, a sense of belonging, an inclusive workplace culture, and the feeling that you as an individual are valued for your lived experiences. That's really what everyone wants at the basic level as an employee. You want to go to a place that values you for who you are and all of your authentic experiences. And, just to weave it all together, Jill and Bridget both mentioned kindness and empathy. And that's where you really have to start from, is that, the people that you're trying to appeal to, they're not they're not an other group. They want the same things that you do, but they might require different methods to make the world more inclusive to them. Because these spaces, these workplace spaces, were not built for people with disabilities. And we're trying to change that. The pandemic has given us the opportunity to change it for the better because, as a person with a disability, I've experienced what it's like to have to hide that in my place of work. And I don't want that going forward. I wouldn't want that for anybody else. So, just starting from kindness and empathy.
Wonderful. And Dorothy, I'm going to turn to you for our next question that came in. The user says, I want to be hopeful, but oftentimes I feel defeated fighting for inclusivity among leadership. Any advice?
I think you have to lead from where you are. I think the hardest thing is to tell someone with a disability to be more open about their disability. It took me many, many years to start talking about having rheumatoid arthritis and a number of other chronic illnesses. But as soon as I did, doors started opening. And that's a very scary first step, is to start talking about yourself, especially in the context of work, where you're supposed to appear like you're a very capable person all the time who can handle all the challenges that are being thrown at you. But I find that if you start from that place of authenticity, of kindness, of empathy, and you give a little bit of yourself, you're going to get so much more in return. And to put it in metric terms, at Disability Inn, we really try to encourage self-ID. We try to encourage people to identify themselves as a person with a disability because, one, it means that you stand in solidarity with the people who can't hide their disabilities. So I have a non-apparent disability. I identify as a person with a disability by choice because other people can't hide theirs. And the second reason is that if you identify as a person with a disability, then your place of work is going to be able to keep track of what your needs and supports are. And they're better able to operate from that place of knowledge if they have the metrics behind it.
Absolutely. Bridget, I want to turn to you for our last Q&A question, which is actually particularly inspiring. What advice would you give for those who are going for a DEI position? Any literature that you can recommend or things that they can use to educate themselves to get into this space?
Great question. There's a ton of literature. I actually think that Jill may have some on the top of her head. There's a ton of literature that I would use that I'm blanking on actually right now. But I would just say, find yourself a position that you're interested in, learn about that organization, but more than anything, immerse yourself in all things DE&I, recognizing what your strengths are, finding the classes, the certifications, whatever it is that can get you a little bit more knowledge so that you truly understand what you're getting yourself into, what the fight is, the extraordinary change that you'll be making, and then go for it. Go for it. No matter what that background is currently, there is a space for you. But as far as literature, I'm going to pop that over to Jill. I think she might actually have some.
Yeah, Jill, what comes to your top of mind?
Well, obviously disability is going to come to my top of mind. So I'm going to call your attention to the Disability Equality Index report from 2021 that's going to identify opportunities in business. And I'm going to call your attention to the Accenture business case, which is called Getting to Equal the Disability Inclusion Advantage.
Awesome. And I know there's a ton of literature on Insider and online. This space is really burgeoning, so it's super exciting. Thank you again, Jill, Bridget, and Dorothy, for your time. This conversation has really inspired and informed me on the future of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We learned about how the conversation around inclusion is changing and what CEOs are doing well when it comes to creating inclusive environments, as well as what they're struggling with. These are topics I'll continue to cover closely at Insider. I definitely recommend checking out our reporting on diversity and inclusion online. And now, back to you, Ashley.
Thank you, Marguerite. And thank you so much, Jill, Dorothy, and Bridget. It's great to hear how the conversation around inclusion is changing and how leaders can create inclusive environments. And what about you? What changes would you like to see in your organization when it comes to inclusion and belonging? Share your responses on social media with the hashtag #InsiderEvents. Up next, we'll hear a conversation about a people-centric approach to business transformation. Please welcome Ebony Flake, C-Suite reporter here at Insider, who covers journeys and obstacles to the C-Suite, and her guest for a discussion entitled Transforming Global Business.
Thanks, Ashley. I'm Ebony Flake, C-Suite reporter at Business Insider. And today we're talking about transforming business. From return to work protocols and vaccination mandates to calls to action around diversity, equity, and inclusion, with every disruption and every global challenge, today's business leaders must embrace transformation faster than ever before. So, how do business leaders balance the rapid pace of change while taking a people-centric approach to transformation? Today's panelists will give us expert insights on these topics. We have Jennifer Moss, award-winning journalist, author, speaker, and strategist driving the conversation towards healthier workplace cultures. We also have Colin Brennan, accomplished executive leader with a proven record of growing business as Chief Customer Officer at Alight Solutions. Business transformation is inevitable, yet it means different things to different people. Colin, how would you define transformation?
That's a great question. And, when I think about transformation, businesses have to respond to change, whether it's technology change or innovation or things that are going on in the environment. And so, throughout the course of time, we've seen the Industrial Revolution and the Digital Revolution. And now, arguably, we're in the People Revolution, and the pandemic has just accelerated that. And so, businesses change due to adapting situations and different dynamics they face in their underlying market. And so, we're in that next phase. And for us, it's all about the people evolution and more about, where people are going and the change driven by people's expectations around technology and access to information and personalization and those things. But businesses are adapting to that even as we speak.
Great answer. Jennifer, how would you define business transformation?
Over the years, I've spent quite a bit of time working with folks around this topic, and it's kind of a nebulous concept. What does it mean to transform? And often people think about transformation as moving in this sort of linear direction forward. I really talk about transformation as just changing shape, the sort of the definition of transforming into something else. And what you do is you often take parts of what you had originally that are working and then try to either augment that or change into a new shape that could be paradigm shifting. It's usually a mixture of a whole bunch of pieces coming together that allow us to take that on that new shape. And, and I've been urging leaders lately to think about transformation as not just having to be thought of as a move in a direction forward, but potentially in a move laterally, thinking about things in a sideways definition around transformation instead of just in this movement towards one goal.
Colin, Alight aids the world's most influential companies with transformation. How does transformation relate to your business internally?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we've seen a lot of transformation inside our business. And, we've been on a journey to move from, historically what was more of a services business to a tech-enabled services business. But, for me, really, the thing that's brought it home is, during the pandemic, we have thousands of customer service agents that help our customers answering questions, taking calls, doing those really important things. And during the pandemic, one of the things we went through was, needing to move people remote, just as many other organizations did. And it was amazing as we went through that process to see people respond and act. But also, we ran into situations where, a call center agent was coming to pick up their desktop and said, I don't have a place to go to take calls. And so, we've seen that transformation continue to happen. And so as we evolve, it's really thinking about, how do we continue to use more technology to assist things? How do we support our people? And I think right now, that's probably the biggest thing. People are our biggest asset. And so, we're thinking about how do we continue to evolve and respond and help them. And that's what we see a lot of businesses working through too. It's really the age of the employee. And so we're seeing a lot of people focus on that experience and how they engage their colleagues and transform their business and the way they work to meet this new situation, but also to meet what employees are looking for.
Jennifer, Colin alluded to this in his answer, but you talk about the mechanics of transformation. You talk about moving at a really fast pace, but also people are central, right? Are kind of the main ingredient when it comes to effectively transforming a business. What steps do leaders need to take in order to have a people-centric approach to transformation?
I love this question because, and what Colin says, we're in this employee age. I mean, we definitely are in this, situation where we have a great resignation, which is something that's terrifying a lot of organizations, this attrition issue. And when it becomes a bottom line issue for organizations, when their employees are leaving, we need to understand really well what it is that is making them leave. And what we're finding is it isn't pay It isn't those compensation and rewards kind of tools like we used before. It is mental health, well-being. It's structure around being able to communicate around our mental health at work, dealing with burnout. There's no way that we can actually have growth at all costs when it means that growing equals the unsustainability of our workforce. And people are really tired right now after going through a global pandemic. And so when we think about paradigm shifting moments of disruption, the pandemic was a major disruption. And if we want to be transformational, it will require us to be thinking in new and different ways around what does transformation, what does success actually look like. And we can't hit those goals if we don't have employees to actually help us hit them. And we are in an interesting and potentially really exciting time if we look at taking the learnings from the pandemic and intentionally bring that forward into the future of work.
I think that's great, Jennifer. Colin, Jennifer mentioned the great resignation, right? We're seeing a mass exodus of really valuable workers from the workforce. Often when it comes to transformation, kind of the last rung on that transformation ladder is the front line. How does Alight Human Capital Solutions aid business transformation from the bottom up?
You said it well, and it may be the last rung, but they're also a lot of times the first rung with our customers, with our people. If you sit in financial services or you're an engineering company, those people are the key, right? They hold the intellectual property. And so, as we think about it, it's thinking about that whole person. I love what Jennifer said about it's about mental health and physical health and fiscal health. And so, we try to think about the whole package and how do you bring it together for people. And I would say what we're seeing more than anything is, you've got to be able to do the right change management and transformation and communication with those folks, but you also have to offer the right programs. And so for us, it kind of starts with looking at what's the breadth of the programs. Is there something there for everybody? And, in the age that we live in today, I talked a little bit earlier about people expect things to be highly personalized to them. When they go out to look for something, they expect it to know what you're looking for and to suggest things and make recommendations. And so, we're building out technology that helps do that. So we're also trying to make things easier for people. And so the world we live in has arguably gotten much more complicated. And, if I think about the space that we play in health and benefits and payroll, those are complex decisions that people are making. And so, we're trying to bring together the technology, the content, making sure employers offer the right programs, but then helping people understand how to use them. And that's one of the biggest challenges we see is employers offer a lot of things to their employees. Half the time people don't know about them or don't realize they can use them in the moments that matter to them. And so for us, it's all about that change management, engaging the employee, making it really personalized, and then using technology to get to them at the right time. So reaching out via text or link at the right moments to catch them. So using those pieces, taking advantage of the new technology, and really getting to how do you think holistically, as Jennifer said, about the person, not just one-dimensionally in one area or another.
Really interesting, Colin. Jennifer, Colin spoke to kind of the speed and the pace of transformation. You think about what we're asking of our leaders, right? We're asking them to take a really quick pivot from the old model of kind of command and control leadership. What kind of resistance to this pace of transition have you seen with the business leaders that you work with?
Well, I can tell you that I've been doing numerous talks titled Exhausted Leaders Leading Exhausted Teams. So if that says anything, we are in a space where there's an expectation on leaders to have all the certainty where they have none. They are expected to pivot on the fly and make change on the fly. Their learning curve is steep. Many, folks in different organizations had never worked remote before. They were in an in-person environment. And then all of a sudden they're trying to make these kind of connections that were just taken for granted by stopping by the desk and, kibitzing in the water cooler, space in the office. And now they're leading in this remote way that's not comfortable for them. So there was a lot of pressure being placed on leaders. And what I've been really encouraging is just for leaders to take a step back right now and recognize that March 15th, 2020, everything changed. We had this complete global disruption and it was an emergency, which is by definition unexpected. We are now 20 months in, and this is no longer unexpected. This is no longer an emergency. It's a crisis and it's endemic. So how do we actually try to consider what are the ways that we can work within this system And what are the things that are still doing that's like we're in an emergency still? Because that's creating a lot of pressure. It's creating inefficiencies. There's workload inefficiencies that are making it harder on us as leaders to manage with our team. And we also need to be able to demonstrate vulnerability. We need to be able to show that we are going through these same things too. This isn't just a reorg where leaders are at the top making decisions and they're not feeling it. There's lots of senior executives that have juggled, parenting and homeschooling in the middle of the pandemic that are still dealing with distractions, that have had grief and loss this year. So we are not impervious. And the more that we can talk with our teams about that, the more likely we are to have just a more cohesive team and a team that can take a breath and relax a little bit more in a time where we really need it the most.
Very good. I'd like to get to one really practical audience question that has come up, and I'd love for both of you to kind of take a stab at answering this one. Colin, I'll start with you. We've been talking about kind of managing employee well-being, prioritizing that along with rapid transformation. Can you give a few very specific ways in which you're balancing employee well-being with transition?
Yeah, definitely. So, as we think about that, the balance between those two, and Jennifer said it well too, the other thing that hasn't changed is the pace. And so, while more people are working from home or remote or in different places, that pace has continued to be there. So as we look at the balance, we're trying to find ways to engage people remotely. So how do you build that sense of community and engagement and foster things? So where we used to be able to do an office party or an event or those things, how do you do that virtually, whether it be a happy hour or those pieces? How do you offer people programs that help keep them engaged and give them more choice and flexibility? We're also trying to look at, to Jennifer's point, from a business priority perspective, how do we stay focused? And so, I think one tendency is we want to do a lot of things all at once. And so how do we get really focused on those things that matter the most? And so for us, as we're doing engagement studies and we're listening to our employees and we're seeing what matters to them, we're trying to bring those programs to light that really help them. And one of the biggest ones we've seen is just the need for flexibility. And so, we're seeing more and more and hearing from our own customer base and from our employers is the ability to offer different things to different people. And so things that my daughter wants, who are just getting out of college, are different than things I want, are different than the benefits my parents want. And so, for some it might be pet insurance, for some it might be more support, for some it might be long-term care, retirement, or putting more in their 401k. And so as we think about it, the big thing that we're focused on is that choice and flexibility. And so how do we give people the right things? And then from a support perspective, how do you give people the support and space they need? Because as Jennifer said too, people are dealing with lots of different things at home, from kids who are at home during the schooling times to dealing for parents or helping with different pieces. And so trying to balance that work and life is the other part that's really important to us. And so we've rolled out a new platform that we think helps do some of that. We're looking at mobile technology to help enable that. We're trying to take decisions off people and remind them to do things. So all those are trade-offs we're making to try to make it easier for people.
Well, I love everything that Colin is saying. I'm so aligned with this concept of asking and trying to find out what is nuanced. Colin also mentioned that personalization. That is what is so critical right now. I have a chapter in the book that's just purely dedicated to how to lead with empathy. And these are the examples. We often don't understand what empathy looks like. And so how do you be an empathetic leader? It sounds very mushy. It sounds kind of like, I don't really know how to wrap my mind around what that is. And it's a soft skill. And I have a hard time with people saying it's a soft skill because it's a very challenging thing to actually create an organization that leads with empathy. But what Colin is saying is just actively listening. Do you need pet insurance? What is it that is really getting at you? And, I have a very practical, tactical way of getting to that for direct managers if they just want to learn. And gathering data and insights is really important in the way that Colin is mentioning too, in these larger surveys and also pulse surveys, et cetera. Anonymous feedback is great. But direct managers should be asking their 3 questions every single week. And I know we have lots of meetings, but we should get rid of those useless meetings, those over collaborative meetings, over looping, and instead include this 1 half-an-hour meeting. And it's 3 questions. First, how are you? People will lie and say they're fine when they're not. So then we need to actually prompt them to this next 2 questions. Let's go around the group and give 1 high and 1 low. Direct managers then have the capacity then to know what motivates people. If someone is saying their pet, 10 weeks in a row, because it probably really means something to them. So then how do we motivate? How do we actually address that? And then if they're saying, I'm really tired or I'm really stressed, that potentially they're leading to burnout. Or they could be saying, I'm dealing with these expenses around, putting my kids through university while I'm dealing with my mom maybe going into assisted living, that sandwich generation. Well, let's direct them to programs that help them save their money or whatever that looks like. So we've got these listening sort of professional eavesdropper roles that managers can play. And then the final piece should be a group conversation. What can we do for each other to make next week a little bit easier? That is what we need to be doing as teams right now. And managers can say, what can I do to make next week a little bit easier? There's small wins, there's small goals, and they create this active listening that designs an organization over time to be more empathetic. And that's why you have all of these tools working together to actually be the most beneficial to both sides. It's a win-win. Lots of, great, happy employees and then really successful businesses.
Awesome insights, Jennifer and Colin, on some really very practical points that leaders can take to make sure that they're transitioning people first. Thank you so much for joining us on this panel today. To the audience, please be sure to follow Business Insider for coverage on these topics. Thanks again, panelists, and back to you, Ashley.
Thank you, Ebony, Jennifer, and Colin. And for all of you watching, please remember to take our survey at any time during the event. Just click on the icon at the bottom of the page. If you're sharing thoughts on social media, please remember to use the hashtag #InsiderEvents. Employee activism is a driving force when it comes to the future of work. Please welcome Insider Senior Correspondent Rebecca Knight, who covers careers and the workplace, and her guest for a discussion entitled Future of Work Reinvented.
Thanks, Ashley. The Alphabet Workers Union announced itself to the world in January of this year and now counts roughly 900 full-time and temporary Google employees, vendors, and contractors among its ranks. At the helm of this effort is Parul Kaul. She is the union's executive chair and a software engineer at Google based in Boston. Kaul has emerged as a leading voice on labor activism in the tech industry, and she is also one of Insider's 100 people transforming business. Welcome, Parul.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Rebecca.
So why don't you start by telling our viewers a little bit more about your union, who you are, and what you stand for?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Alphabet Workers Union went public almost a year ago now. We are a non-contract union that is open to all employees at Alphabet. That includes Google and its various other subsidiary entities. And we're open to full-time workers who are employed by Google or Alphabet, but also the vast number of temps, vendors, and contractors that comprise Google's two-tier workforce.
So let's talk about the impetus for this union. In a New York Times op-ed that ran in January of this year, you wrote that for too long, thousands of us at Google have had our workplace concerns dismissed by executives. Our bosses have collaborated with repressive governments. They have developed artificial intelligence technology for use by the Department of Defense and profited from ads by a hate group. And they have failed to make the changes necessary to meaningfully address our retention issues with people of color. Tell our viewers a little bit more about the emotions and the experiences that led you and your colleagues to want to form a union.
Yeah, I think there's two parts to this. There's the anger and fear and disaffection that has characterized so much of the tech industry, and frankly, every industry in the last 2 years as we've lived into the pandemic, when we've seen workplace conditions worsen, when we've seen literally the state of the world melt in front of our eyes and seen our leadership and companies struggle to keep up with those changes. But I think thinking back to the much longer history of organizing at Google and other tech companies, I think tech workers are driven by a profound love for the work that they do and their coworkers, and a deep respect for the end user. And that makes seeing, violations of ethical conduct, violations of workplace standards and ethics very difficult to stomach. I think that's what's ultimately driving the surge of tech organizing.
So Google's decision to terminate Dr. Timnit Gebru, one of the star artificial intelligence researchers and a foremost Black woman in the field, was another flashpoint for union organizers. Gebru said she was fired after a dispute over a research paper she'd co-authored. Talk a little bit more about that and what it was like for you at Google.
Yeah, I think, Dr. Gebru's firing was a terrible event that symbolized a lot of what is wrong with the way people of color and people of marginalized identities are treated at Google. And, like you mentioned, I think it galvanized a lot of people towards critiquing the company and getting involved with activism. But one of the most important threads that stood out to me about that conversation were women and other marginalized people saying, if something like this can happen to a researcher and a scholar of Dr. Gebru's stature, just imagine what's happening to people who don't have the same voice and platform that she has.
So it got at both the two-tier workforce and the equity issues, which you've talked about before.
Right. And I think it's really important to highlight the ways in which those two issues intersect, right? Google and other tech companies have a massive part of their workforce that doesn't technically work for them and is employed by third-party companies. We've been asking for a racial audit and a gender-based audit of those employees to understand what that workforce is actually like, because it's probably going to confirm our understanding that that workforce is comprised mostly of people of color, of women, of people of more marginalized backgrounds located in parts of the country that have worse labor laws and environmental protections. And that these two systems merge to really uphold the structural inequities that we see in our society.
What would you say to those who are cynical or skeptical about unions and who say that tech companies are more innovative, more inventive, and more creative without unions?
Great question. Ultimately, my work and the work that we do in our union is advocating for workers. And in a sense, it isn't our job to speak about, assuage the fears of skeptics who feel like innovation and creativity should be placed above workers' safety and proper working conditions and respect and dignity in the workplace. What I will say is that I think the tech industry and most other industries thrive when their workers are committed to the work that they do and they believe in it and they want to see it improve. And you can't have any of those things when the conditions you literally work under are making your life worse or are hurting your ability to take care of your family, to have stable mental health, to provide for them. And that's what unions are fighting for. Unions are fighting for better conditions for workers. And I think that's ultimately a prerequisite for the success of any, innovation or creativity in the workplace.
When you think about what first drew you to Google as an employer and drew your colleagues there too, in terms of what Google stood for and what it was doing and what you aspired to do in your career, can you talk a little bit about those aspirations and the reality?
Absolutely. It's not a secret that I think Google for a long time has publicized itself as being a more progressive tech company. Its ethos of don't be evil, regardless of how far they've strayed from that, is still something that draws people to it because, talented and committed technologists still want to make sure that what their labor contributes to isn't harming the world. And I can't, in good faith say that about Google anymore, frankly, but it is one of the things that drew me to work at this company and not another one. And it's that same adherence to those principles and love for those values that's led to so many of us being involved in the Alphabet Workers Union, because we want our work to be meaningful. We want our work to not hurt people in other countries or in the United States itself. And that's what is driving everything we do, even as organizers.
So, Parul, where do you see the future of employee activism? So, on one hand, we see it gaining strength among white-collar employees and workers in Silicon Valley in the past few years. But on the other hand, union membership is at historical lows. It's been on the decline for many, many years. And its power is declining in part because of large companies like Amazon and Starbucks and Target that have the ability to prevent union drive. So where do you see unions going into next year and even in the years to come?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked because, I agree with you that union membership and labor act organizing has been at a historic low point. But I actually strongly believe that we're at an inflection point, and I think this year has been the perfect example of that. We're seeing more new organizing drives and efforts to form unions than ever before. It's really revitalized the tech organizing scene with Code CWA, our international union. And frankly, we're making gains. I think yesterday's, court ruling that Amazon interfered with the union election in Bessemer itself is, suggesting that there are going to be more opportunities for us to continue organizing. And something that's, I think, missed in these conversations is that those kinds of wins, those kinds of big power shifts don't come after, 1 year, one attempt. It's often going to take years of trying again and again for those wins to really occur. And everything that's happened this year, the historic strikes, the historic, strike authorization votes in and of themselves, I think should make us very, very hopeful and optimistic about the future of labor organizing.
So, Parul, the COVID pandemic is ongoing. The Great Resignation is gathering steam, and the future of work, how we work, where we work, who we work with, what we work on, those things are still up in the air. I want to hear your best advice for the other union leaders out there and the people who are thinking about organizing within their organizations, and then your best advice for business leaders as they enter 2022. So talk first to the union leaders out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we are at, like I said, an inflection point. There's far more opportunities now than we've had in the past, and I think we have to think creatively about how they can be harnessed to win greater concessions from employers. It's very exciting to see that workers are finally putting their foot down after years and years of disrespect from their employers. I think that the context of the pandemic and everything else that's happened in the world and how difficult it has been to sustain ourselves and our families over the past 2 years. I think it's really brought people to a breaking point. I guess my, primary encouragement is we're not alone in this struggle, and there's a lot to be gained by turning to the people around us and realizing that working together, we can actually, win greater concessions from our employers instead of perhaps creating a situation where we're walking away from jobs due to that frustration when really we're at a point where we could win even more if we got together and organized.
There's strength in numbers.
Yeah, there's a huge strength in numbers and there's huge untapped potential. And I think encouraging that new organizing and giving it support and structure and education is what a lot of unions need to be thinking about right now.
So that's your advice to union leaders. What's your advice to business leaders as we enter the new year?
Sure. I mean, to be honest, I don't really have any advice for business leaders, right? There's no way to prevent this kind of work from happening because frankly, as a union leader, it's exciting. And if there's an organizing drive happening at your company, my advice would be to, not stand in the way and be a union buster first and foremost. But really, my other piece of advice is that people want real respect and real dignity on the job. It's not a day off here and there or a subscription to, a mental health chat app or something like that. People want to be treated with real respect. People have always wanted that. And it's time that you start thinking about what you can change in your workplace.
Parul, is there a recent win you want to highlight?
Yeah, I'm really excited to share this story actually because it happened just a couple weeks ago. There were a number of data center technicians at a Google data center in South Carolina who had been promised a a bonus for working, 40-hour weeks in person during the pandemic. So they were promised a weekly bonus that was supposed to start in August and then continue through December. And a $400 bonus is a lot of money when you're making $15 an hour, which is what a lot of these workers were making. And at the beginning of October, they stopped receiving those payments. And there was no explanation for why or when they would resume. And then just a couple weeks ago, they received communication from their management that the bonuses were being canceled entirely. There was going to be no back pay for the month of October, that people had, still been working those full 40-hour weeks with the expectation that those bonuses would be paid out, which is, frankly, just a terrible situation. And I think goes back to my previous answer, the complete lack of respect and dignity and just communication that this management, they couldn't meet that basic bar. And so workers at this data center, that included AWU members, among it, started raising a ruckus on their internal communication platform. Some of them, mass filed tickets. And some of our leaders there sent out a survey calling to ask people how they were feeling about this and organizing a mass meeting to bring all of the 250 or so affected workers together. And 20 minutes before our meeting was supposed to happen to discuss what we were going to do, we get an email from their management saying, "Oh, we're so sorry. We're going to take back everything we just said a couple of days ago. Here's your bonus. And also here's back pay for the month of work that you've been doing." And just an incredible story of the fact that, when companies so flagrantly just disrespect their workers, people get pissed off. And it frankly doesn't take a lot for the company to backtrack once they realize that, hey, people are talking to one another and are willing to flex their power in a collective fashion. So I wanted to share that story because it's, a small win in a sense, but it's kind of illustrates what is possible and the fact that it doesn't even take that much effort to win something like $200,000 back in bonuses.
And the solidarity that's there. So much of the conversation in the national conversation, as well as the conversation in corporate America, is around diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging. How does that tie into the labor movement today?
I'm, really glad you asked this question because I think it is a huge part of what ties into the labor organizing you're seeing today. And I'll take myself as an example, as a young person of color, as a woman, not necessarily very well represented in the labor movement, especially, the labor movement that's consisting of, new professions in the labor movement. And I think DEI issues are a huge motivating factor. I think people are really tired of seeing a lot of conversation, a lot of trainings, a lot of, spaces within the workplace to talk about these issues, but not actually seeing the numbers move or not seeing the numbers change. I think people recognize that simply calling on your leaders to make the changes you want on these issues isn't enough, and that empty promise after empty promise is going to lead people to look to other ways of winning those concessions. And I think labor is ultimately the tool that workers have at their disposal to win concessions from their bosses on these issues. And that's why so much of the tech organizing you're seeing right now is led by people from those marginalized backgrounds.
Parul, thank you so much for joining us today.
Of course. Thank you for having me, Rebecca.
And thank you for watching. I'm Rebecca Knight. Back to you, Ashley.
Thank you, Rebecca. And thank you, Parul, for that thoughtful discussion. It's great. It's a great new way to look at the future of work. Another sector that experiences vast transformation is healthcare. The pandemic has raised the importance of healthcare organizations actively choosing, accelerating, and extending their innovation efforts. For our final session, please welcome Mohana Ravindranath, Senior Healthcare Reporter, and her guest, who discuss ways to propel healthcare into the future. Over to you, Mohana.
Thank you, Ashley, for that introduction. Welcome to Business Insider's Healthcare Transformer series. Over the course of the pandemic, we've seen hospitals completely transform, whether it's switching to telemedicine literally overnight or using artificial intelligence to figure out which patients need medical attention the most. For example, layering algorithms on top of health records to figure out where limited staff needs to focus. We're also on the cusp of another transformation in the economics of healthcare. Increasingly, we are aiming to reward doctors for the quality of the care they provide, not for the number of the services they complete. I'm here with Farzad Mostashari, one of Business Insider's healthcare transformers. Farzad is the CEO of Alight, a software company that helps clinics participate in that economic shift. He was also the top health IT official in the federal government under Obama. Farzad is no stranger to innovation in healthcare, whether it's setting the standards for health data or changing the way that we pay for healthcare. Farzad, thank you so much for being here. You've said in the past that a lot of the health tech that we're seeing today is the result of investments maybe 10 or 15 years ago, and maybe even what we consider moonshot investments. And I'd love to hear maybe some practical tips for businesses looking to make very early investments in technology so that they'll be ready for what's coming down the line in healthcare, maybe even getting ahead of the next public health crisis.
There's Amal's theorem goes that we always overestimate the impact of technology in the short term, and we underestimate it in the long run. And I think that's the case for a lot of technologies that we invest in. Inevitably people think that it's going to make a bigger difference in a shorter time frame, and then there's some disappointment that it didn't completely transform, what we do in the short term. But then over time, it's when workflows get changed, when workflows take advantage of the digital transformation that we see the biggest opportunities. And so in healthcare, writ large, 10 years ago is when we really started the steep part of the curve of moving away from paper and pen to electronic health records. And at the time, there was a lot of disappointment as to, the world isn't transformed yet. Like we still, healthcare isn't appreciably on the outcomes any different. And that's true because among other problems, we didn't change the way we pay for healthcare, which we'll come to. But it did set the stage. So once that data is electronic, it's digital, there's so much more that we can do and layer on top of it. And that's what we've seen, I think, in the past few years.
I'm wondering if you have any sort of tips for maybe business leaders in other industries for figuring out what is sort of the linchpin, what is the thing we need to be investing in now so that we can be ready for this kind of transformation a decade in advance.
It's always about thinking about your workflows and how can you, the term in informatics is not pave the cow paths. Talking about the streets in Boston that are winding and they just took literally the route that the cows used to go and then they paved them over and you don't get any efficiencies from that. So thinking about the fundamental infrastructure that your business operates on and thinking about how not only can you replace and modernize some of those, whether it's with data models or artificial intelligence, but really thinking about the workflow layer. So generally every application we think about, right, we think about the triple layer cake. There's the data on the bottom, right? And we end up spending 90% of our time and attention, not on the fancy application layer, but on the data layer and making sure that the data structures are right. And then the middle layer is the algorithms and being able to predict, being able to prioritize, being able to glean insights. And then the third layer is the action layer, is what is it that the user's experience of being guided through a new habit and to make that habit easier to take. And then, of course, the fourth layer is the reporting layer, the management layer, which is so important for businesses to be able to instrument what all three layers are, in particular the third layer, to be able to know what your people are doing and what are the results that you're getting for the investments you're making.
You've spent quite a bit of time in government working on the sort of one of these layers that you're talking about. And I'm just wondering if you can talk about, since you've been on both sides, some specific ways that the government and the private sector can work better together to ensure that the latest technology can actually be implemented, in your case, in healthcare.
Yeah, this is the role of government, and I'm a big believer that, we sometimes need to act collectively, and, we call that government. So how is it that we can define in the most useful way the role of government without having regulations have a stifling impact on innovation? And I think it is a really, really compelling case to be made for businesses to be involved and engaged in federal and other regulatory processes. The government, has a lot of rules and laws that require it to seek input. And I think all too often private sector participants don't engage. They think that there's no use with them engaging with those processes, and that's absolutely wrong. The regulators want to make the best decisions, and they need information from people on the front lines to be able to make those decisions. As a general rule, what I have found is that government is best when we can set the rules of the road and let the individual competitors compete within that. And I think in particular to address market failures, there are a lot of people who say like, oh, we should not have any involvement of the government, but then they also complain about, lack of competition or consolidation or other high switching costs or other sources of market failure. So that one in particular, I think high switching cost is something that government action can ensure data transparency, liquidity, so that people can switch from one system to the other, and that we can, not have rent seeking from, monopolistic actors. I think that's a particularly one that is close into my heart, because it was a lot of what we thought about in the healthcare technology space.
And when you're talking about participation, you're talking about things like commenting on regulations or on draft regulations, things like this, or what exactly does that look like from a business perspective?
Yeah, so there's a well-trod procedure under the Administrative Procedures Act in the federal government where regulators have to give notices of proposed rulemaking, and then there's a comment period, and then there's a review period, and then they come out with a final rule. You should have people who read those proposed rules or engage in associations or other collective groups that can provide that feedback, but also don't be afraid to directly reach out. I remember when I was the national coordinator, we'd get these lobbyists walking in, industry leaders into my office. And I would sometimes turn to the industry leaders and say, like, you could have just called me, you don't need to actually get a lobbyist to be heard if you have something to say. And the other piece of advice I have is don't talk about what you want, right? Like that's what the regulator is seeing all day long. They're seeing people coming in saying, this would be good for me. This would be good for me. Like, do what I want, right? And it's like, that's not very compelling. You should try to understand what is the policymaker's objectives. What are they trying to do? Pretend that you're the regulator and you want to do what's best for America. Then make the case for why they should make this change, because it's not only going to help your business, but it's also going to help the country. And don't drink your own Kool-Aid. If what you're saying just helps you and actually doesn't help the country, then don't bother going in and making that case, because they've probably heard it all before.
So speaking of these kinds of big changes, let's talk about value-based care. You actually left government to start Alight to focus on that transition to value-based care that we talked about a little bit earlier. So for viewers who don't know, maybe can you break down what value-based care means and how it's so different from the system that we have right now?
So in the system that we have now, it is more profitable to wait until someone has a stroke and then treat them for the stroke. There's a lot of money in treating strokes, and nobody makes a profit preventing a stroke. So just think about it from an economic point of view. You're going to have, neuro ICUs and high-tech imaging centers and purveyors of electric wheelchairs for people who have strokes. And you're not going to have a lot of investment in things that we know we can do to prevent strokes, like controlling people's blood pressure, which we do 2/3 of the time. A third of the time, someone with high blood pressure who's at risk of having a stroke is not going to have it controlled, because fundamentally, from a systems point of view, we are incentivizing strokes and heart attacks and kidney failures and heart failure. That's what we're incentivizing. So that's what we're getting, and that's what we're treating. And we have $3.5 trillion a year going to the consequences of those actions. So value-based care says, let us make it so that it is more profitable for somebody to prevent a stroke than to treat it. And the way these models work is that for a population of patients, whoever's footing the bill, whether it's the employer or the government, says, okay, I'm expecting to spend this much next year on this population based on past history. If you, the doctors, the primary care practices, can work to deliver better care to that patient, more primary care, more prevention, so they have fewer hospitalizations, I'll share it with you, right? You get to keep some of it. I get to keep some of it. It's a win-win-win for everybody. Win for the patient, win for the doctor, win for the society and the employer. So that's what value-based care is. And it's kind of taken off because, it's like Winston Churchill said about Americans, we'll always do the right thing after we've exhausted all other possibilities.
Well, I want to hear a little bit more about what it takes to get there for most of the country. It seems like there are, smaller groups that are kind of maybe in the early stages of trotting out this model, but it's certainly not the majority. I'm just wondering if you can talk about what you need to do to actually achieve this vision.
Yeah. So for us, the most important thing was finding the right people in the ecosystem to do this. And everyone thinks of healthcare and they think of hospitals. And our kind of a little bit counter consensus view at that time was hospitals will not know how to reduce hospitalizations. So you have to go upstream to primary care. And so the only problem was primary care, it's fragmented. They don't have the data. They don't have the technology. They don't have the types of contracts. They don't have the scale. And so I was like, okay, that's it. We'll create a company that gives them all of that. So we now have 1,000 practices across 38 states, 1.4 million patients, about $14 billion a year in medical spending that our network of primary care practices is managing. And we're able to give them the benefits of that scale. And we're seeing 15% reductions in hospitalizations of all causes. So that's like curing cancer in terms of the number of hospitalizations prevented in the population that we serve. And it seems to be working.
I'm curious if there are any asks that you have from business leaders, maybe in other industries, in terms of achieving value-based care, maybe even more broadly outside of Alight. What can they do to?
I think the health benefits products that we buy is just broken. The incentives are not aligned. And when we buy healthcare for our employees, we're the benefits advisors and consultants and the TPAs and the carriers who come to pitch us, they are not paid the right way. So they're, whether they're paid a fee or whether they're paid a percent of what you spend, they have no incentive to prevent strokes, to make sure your people have good access to primary care and that they get prevention, not treatment. It's all focused on treatment. It's all focused on like fake discounts off of list prices that, the hospitals and health systems can just jack up year over year. And we're seeing, we're not seeing great quality. We're not seeing improvements in costs, certainly. So what we have to do is we have to demand more. We have to say we actually want to have these kind of value-based or accountable care payment models where if the primary care practices and others caring for these patients deliver lower trend than everybody else, then we should reward them because it's good for my employees, it's good for me, and it's good for the broader society.
So a lot of the changes we're talking about require a huge amount. It seems like just such a heavy lift, I guess, in terms of changing incentives across this entire industry. But I'm wondering how much power you think patients and providers, individual providers, have in implementing this. Do you have any asks for them? Is this something that maybe they can bring up, patients can bring up with their doctors or their insurers? And thinking about that sort of back and forth you were talking about with the private sector and government, how can people, individuals, patients or clinicians, doctors, nurses, how can they participate in this shift?
It's a little bit easier for clinicians. They're about a third of all primary care providers are now signed up with the federal government's Medicare's value-based models, the Medicare Shared Savings Program. And it's a great model to begin with. And you can then extend it to your commercial and other populations. So I think that there are, one-sided risk models. One-sided risk means, gain share only, right? Like if you reduce costs, you get paid. If you don't, then you're held harmless to begin with. And there's no reason, it's just such a low regret thing. There's no reason why any primary care provider should not sign up with, that program. And groups like Alight will help you do it safely, essentially at no cost with a gain share. For patients, it's a little bit more complicated because you don't really get to choose, and you oftentimes don't even know that whether your doctor, what their incentives are. Like, are your doctor's incentives to get more treatment for you and get you more procedures done in the hospital or run that ATM machine up on you? Or is your doctor's incentives to actually keep you healthy and out of the hospital? And I think it's worth asking your primary care doctor whether they're part of these value-based models.
I want to talk a little bit about the intersection between value-based care and health technology, and sort of what technology enables value-based care, but also vice versa. What kinds of new things can we do once we achieve that model?
Oh, fantastic question. This is one of those things where if value-based care is the fuel for a new payment system, data is the oxygen that we needed in order to get it to not choke. And so I'll give you one very concrete example. My mom, she got sick, went to the emergency room, came home, still not feeling well, and was prescribed a medication from the emergency room. And her risk of bouncing back to the emergency room or being hospitalized is very high in the next couple of weeks. One thing that might help is if her primary care practice called her and said, "Hey, we heard you're in the emergency room. How are you feeling? Are you okay? Did you know that you could have called us? Do you want to come in to see us?" Right? What's going on with your medications? What's going on with the pain or whatever it was, right? That could be literally a lifesaver. When my mom went to the emergency room, her primary care practice didn't call. Why didn't they call? It was in the same building as the emergency room, but they never heard about it. Not only did they not hear about it, they didn't have any systems to call patients. They wait for patients to call them. They didn't have a system to call patients. And the reason why they didn't have any systems is they have no financial incentives to spend money calling patients to keep them healthy and out of the hospital. Contrast that with our network of practices. In Kansas, in rural Kansas, 95% of our patients who went to the emergency room got a phone call from their primary care practice. Why? Because we got the data in real time from the hospitals. When someone goes to the emergency room, we match it up to our patient rosters. We prioritize who's at highest risk of bouncing back. We create a workflow and a tool to make it easy for those patients to get called. And there are financial incentives for those practices that make sense for them to spend that time and effort. And then we have reporting and management and competition and incentives to make sure that those practices continually improve. So that's just a very concrete example of how the 4 layers of the data that I talked about, right? Getting the data in the first place, having the algorithms to prioritize, having a workflow, and then having management on top of it and reporting creates new habits, new capability set that are tied to better care.
Well, Farzad, thank you so much for tying this all together. I think we're getting a really good sense of how it's the data standards, it's the data itself, maybe all these devices, it's the participation between clinicians and patients and payers that are really forming this vision of value-based care, which is, as we talked about earlier, just one of the many transformations we're seeing in healthcare. It'll hopefully will approach that model in the years coming down the line. So I really appreciate your insights, and thank you all for watching.
Thank you, Mohana, and thank you again to all of our panelists and speakers. We also want to thank our presenting partner, Alight, for making today's event possible. Today, we heard some great leaders and their stories of transforming business. I hope you were inspired by these conversations. However, the discussion doesn't have to end here. These are topics we will continue to cover diligently at Insider and in a variety of ways. Please remember to share your thoughts using the hashtag InsiderEvents. In a few moments, our survey will pop up on your screen. We'd love to hear your feedback. I'm Ashley Davis. Thank you all for joining.
Saw you in the back corner. You caught me looking back twice at you. You got me tripping over tables, looking like a man who don't think he's able. And you talk to the others like rain in the summer. I'll pretend that you're seeing me too. I was never looking for love until I met you. I was just a walking right through. Everyone was staring at you. I always wish that I could stay high with you. I always wish that I could stay high.